In the sweltering heat of August 1942, deep within the dense and tangled jungles near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, Japanese forces under the command of Colonel Kona Ichiki embarked on what they believed would be a swift and decisive operation. These soldiers, many of whom had seen action in China and Southeast Asia, carried with them an unshakable confidence in their own fighting spirit, reinforced by years of near-constant victory. The Imperial Japanese Army, steeped in a culture that glorified courage, discipline, and the concept of the indomitable warrior, had long underestimated the capabilities of Western forces, viewing them as soft, poorly trained, and ill-prepared for the rigors of sustained combat. This overconfidence would prove to be the first of many miscalculations that would define the initial stages of the Guadalcanal Campaign. On the night of August 18th, 6 Japanese destroyers silently delivered Ichiki's first element, 917 men from the 28th Infantry Regiment, to Taivu Point, approximately 15 miles east of the American defensive perimeter. The landing went undetected, and for Ichiki it seemed that fortune had smiled upon them. He had received clear orders to await reinforcements before attempting any offensive action to retake Henderson Field, yet his contempt for the enemy and his trust in the inherent superiority of Japanese combat prowess led him to dismiss caution. He believed that his veteran troops, trained in night fighting, close-quarters combat, and bayonet assaults, could sweep aside the Americans in a single audacious strike. The Japanese intelligence reports he had studied were filled with assumptions and prejudices. American soldiers were thought to be prone to panic, lacking discipline, and dependent on material comforts that supposedly made them unsuitable for prolonged warfare. Ichiki's doctrine and planning rested on centuries of military tradition and recent successes, emphasizing the psychological and spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors over Western troops. In his mind, victory was inevitable, and any hesitation was a sign of weakness. On the other side, the American forces stationed on Guadalcanal were far from the fragile, untested soldiers the Japanese had imagined. 2 weeks earlier, on August 7, 1942, over 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division had stormed ashore at Lunga Point in the first American offensive of the Pacific War, codenamed Operation Watchtower. Their objectives were straightforward on paper: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield and establish a defensive perimeter to hold the position until reinforcements arrived. The Marines, led by General Alexander Vandegrift, faced a hellish environment: dense jungle, swamps, kunai grass, extreme heat, near-constant humidity, and a host of tropical diseases. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers posed constant threats. Yet the Americans quickly adapted to the terrain, recognizing that the environment could be turned to their advantage. By the first morning of August 8th, the Marines found Henderson Field largely undefended, as the Japanese construction workers and naval troops had fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and the airfield itself. American engineers immediately began work on the runway, setting the stage for the establishment of the Cactus Air Force, which would become a decisive factor in controlling the surrounding seas and skies. The Japanese, meanwhile, had already suffered a significant naval setback during the night of August 9th, when Vice Admiral Gonichi Mikawa's surprise attack sank 4 heavy cruisers, leaving American forces temporarily cut off and vulnerable. Despite these initial difficulties, the Marines rapidly consolidated their positions and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. Ichiki's approach, however, ignored the evolving reality on the ground. On August 19th, a routine reconnaissance patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, encountered Japanese soldiers along the coastal track near Kohi Point. The clash was brief but violent. 31 Japanese soldiers were killed, and critical intelligence was captured, revealing both the presence of a significant enemy force and the Japanese underestimation of American strength. Captain Brush rushed back to the American lines, delivering this intelligence to General Vandegrift, who immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Defensive measures were strengthened along the sandbar at the mouth of the river, with machine guns strategically positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The Americans had not only learned of the Japanese advance, but had begun transforming the environment itself into a formidable barrier against enemy action. Despite this, Ichiki, driven by pride and arrogance, chose to ignore both the captured intelligence and his orders to wait for reinforcements. He believed that a sudden, frontal assault under the cover of darkness would allow his soldiers to exploit their superior spirit and night-fighting skills, overwhelming the Americans before they could properly react. On the night of August 20th, his men advanced across the sandbar in a series of charging waves, their battle cries echoing through the tropical night. What followed was a systematic slaughter. The Marines, well prepared and strategically positioned, unleashed devastating firepower. M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns, capable of sustained rapid fire, tore through the Japanese ranks, while 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded with canister rounds, cut down soldiers with horrific efficiency. Every attempt at close-quarters combat was met with coordinated fire, and despite moments of heroism and determination on both sides, the assault collapsed. By dawn, more than 800 of Ichiki's 917 men were dead, with the remainder scattered into the jungle, and Ichiki himself was among the fallen. The Battle of the Tenaru River became one of the most one-sided engagements in Marine Corps history, and it marked the beginning of a profound psychological shock for Japanese forces. For the first time, they encountered an enemy who did not panic under night attacks, who fought from prepared positions, and whose firepower and coordination rendered traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. This initial encounter exposed the deep flaws in Japanese assumptions about modern warfare. Their emphasis on individual courage, spiritual power, and aggressive assault tactics was insufficient against a force that leveraged material advantage, coordinated firepower, and defensive ingenuity. The jungle, which the Japanese had hoped to exploit as a cover for infiltration and surprise attacks, instead became a trap, amplifying the effects of American preparation and firepower. Disease, exhaustion, and the unfamiliar environment further compounded Japanese losses, revealing that their warriors' traditional strengths, night combat, bayonet charges, and fearless assaults, were inadequate in the face of systematic and industrial warfare. The landing at Taivu Point and the subsequent disaster at the Tenaru River represented more than a tactical failure. It was the opening chapter in the Guadalcanal Campaign that would redefine the rules of engagement for both sides. Ichiki's overconfidence exemplified a broader miscalculation by the Japanese military. The belief that valor and close combat skill could compensate for deficiencies in logistics, equipment, and intelligence. The reality of American jungle warfare was brutal, methodical, and overwhelming. The Marines' ability to combine terrain advantage, coordinated firepower, and disciplined defensive tactics transformed the jungle from an obstacle into a weapon, systematically dismantling the Japanese army's preconceived notions of invincibility. In conclusion, the landing of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal in August 1942 and their subsequent engagement with American troops highlighted a catastrophic misjudgment rooted in overconfidence, cultural assumptions, and flawed intelligence. The Japanese soldiers arrived expecting an easy victory, relying on the perceived superiority of their fighting spirit and combat experience. Instead, they encountered an enemy prepared to exploit the environment, leverage technology, and sustain combat through superior logistics. The resulting slaughter not only decimated Ichiki's force, but also marked the first of many moments on Guadalcanal where Japanese assumptions about warfare would be violently overturned, signaling the beginning of a campaign that would challenge the limits of endurance, strategy, and understanding.
By the time the Japanese realized the full scale of their miscalculation on Guadalcanal, the American forces had already begun to consolidate their positions and exploit the unique advantages of the terrain, technology, and defensive preparation. From the earliest days of Operation Watchtower, the Marines recognized that their success depended not merely on occupying ground, but on transforming the unforgiving jungle and swamp into a defensive network that could neutralize Japanese offensive capabilities. The Americans, despite being new to jungle warfare on this scale, quickly adapted their tactics, leveraging lessons learned from earlier Pacific skirmishes in places like New Britain and the Solomon Islands, as well as their institutional doctrine emphasizing firepower, coordination, and defensive depth. These adaptations, combined with the natural advantages offered by the terrain and climate, allowed the Marines to create a defensive advantage that would prove decisive in the months to come. Central to this advantage was the establishment and rapid fortification of Henderson Field. Seized almost intact after the initial landings, the airfield became more than just a strategic asset. It was the linchpin of American operations on Guadalcanal. From Henderson Field, the newly formed Cactus Air Force could project air power over the surrounding seas, providing reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction of Japanese supply lines. This air superiority, even if intermittent at first, forced the Japanese to commit resources and risk their ships whenever they attempted to resupply or reinforce their troops on the island. The presence of the airfield also allowed American ground forces to coordinate closely with air operations, a synergy that the Japanese had not anticipated and for which they were ill prepared. By integrating infantry positions with artillery, machine guns, and air support, the Marines effectively multiplied the impact of each individual soldier, turning what seemed like limited manpower into a formidable, force-multiplying network. Terrain management and the understanding of Guadalcanal's natural features played an equally critical role. The island's dense jungle, steep ridges, mangrove swamps, and treacherous rivers could have been liabilities, but American forces turned them into obstacles for the Japanese attackers. The Marines carefully selected defensive positions that maximized fields of fire, often clearing areas of vegetation to create kill zones while maintaining sufficient cover to shield themselves from enemy observation. Natural choke points, such as the Tanaru and Ilu rivers, were fortified with machine guns, mortars, and barbed wire, allowing smaller American units to resist much larger forces effectively. The Marines also utilized the interior ridgelines to establish observation posts and interlocking defensive positions, ensuring that any Japanese advance could be detected early and engaged before reaching the American perimeter. By controlling the high ground and shaping the battlefield to their advantage, the Americans forced the Japanese into predictable avenues of attack where disciplined firepower could inflict maximum casualties. Discipline and coordination further enhanced the defensive advantage. Unlike Japanese tactics that emphasized rapid, aggressive assaults, often relying on shock and spiritual courage, American doctrine prioritized controlled engagement, fire discipline, and coordination between units. Infantry squads and platoons trained in interlocking fields of fire ensured that every attack could be met with simultaneous, overlapping coverage from multiple weapon systems. Machine gun teams, often emplaced in concealed positions, provided sustained fire to suppress and break up enemy formations, while artillery observers adjusted indirect fire in real time to support the frontline units. The use of grenades, mortars, and close support rifles allowed Marines to engage the enemy even in close-quarters jungle fighting, countering the Japanese reliance on bayonet charges. Communications, while primitive compared to modern standards, were sufficient to allow coordinated responses to Japanese movements, enabling small units to react dynamically to threats while maintaining cohesion. Logistics and supply lines were another critical factor. The Americans, despite being thousands of miles from their home bases, prioritized establishing secure supply chains that could sustain prolonged operations. Engineers and logistical personnel worked tirelessly to maintain roads, airstrips, and supply caches, ensuring that frontline units had access to ammunition, food, medical care, and reinforcements. This ability was particularly important in the face of Japanese attacks that aimed to cut off the Marines from their lifelines. The ability to rapidly resupply, reinforced by the dominance of the surrounding sea and air lanes, allowed the Americans to hold their positions even when under intense pressure, creating a stark contrast with Japanese troops who often faced shortages and relied on perilous naval convoys vulnerable to interdiction. Supply security, in combination with the defensive infrastructure, meant that American soldiers could fight with confidence, knowing that their basic needs and ammunition would be replenished even under sustained attack. The psychological dimension of defense also played a vital role. The Marines understood that morale was intertwined with survivability and tactical success. Commanders like General Vandegrift emphasized small unit leadership, delegation of responsibility, and the reinforcement of initiative among junior officers and non-commissioned officers. Soldiers were encouraged to understand the tactical value of their positions, take pride in their fortifications, and act decisively when encountering the enemy. This approach contrasted sharply with Japanese reliance on rigid hierarchy and blind adherence to orders, where initiative at lower levels was often discouraged unless it aligned with pre-existing doctrine. The ability of American troops to adapt in the heat of battle, to exploit opportunities, and to coordinate with adjacent units reinforced the resilience of the defensive lines, making each position a strong point capable of withstanding repeated assaults. Perhaps most significantly, technology amplified every aspect of the American defensive advantage. Automatic weapons, such as the Browning 1919 and 1917 machine guns, allowed small units to deliver a volume of fire far beyond what the Japanese infantry could achieve with bolt-action rifles. Artillery, including 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm guns, provided devastating indirect fire support, enabling the Marines to disrupt enemy formations before they reached the lines. Even small-caliber mortars gave frontline squads the ability to target enemy positions concealed by jungle foliage, turning the terrain into a force multiplier rather than a liability. Communication equipment, although rudimentary, enabled coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support, allowing for synchronized responses that magnified the impact of defensive positions. In essence, the combination of disciplined tactics and technological advantage allowed a relatively small number of Marines to resist and defeat numerically superior Japanese forces, overturning the assumptions that had guided Japanese planning. By the end of August 1942, the cumulative effect of terrain, fortifications, logistics, discipline, morale, and technology had created an American defensive advantage that was both tangible and psychological. Japanese forces were confronted with a reality far different from the assumptions that had guided their planning. The Americans were neither fragile nor disorganized. They were disciplined, coordinated, and deeply entrenched in positions optimized for maximum defensive efficiency. Any attempt to engage in frontal assaults or night attacks, tactics that had historically served the Japanese army well, now resulted in catastrophic losses. The defensive advantage of the Americans was not a single factor, but an integrated system where environment, preparation, and innovation reinforced each other, creating a complex web that Japanese attackers struggled to penetrate. In conclusion, the American defensive advantage on Guadalcanal was the product of foresight, adaptability, and an ability to exploit both natural and technological resources to the fullest extent. From the fortification of Henderson Field and the strategic use of terrain, to disciplined fire control, coordinated operations, and reliable logistics, the Marines transformed the island into a fortress capable of resisting repeated Japanese assaults. The combination of these factors did more than protect American positions. It reshaped Japanese expectations about what a determined and technologically equipped enemy could achieve. This advantage would prove decisive in the early months of the Guadalcanal Campaign, demonstrating that preparation, adaptability, and combined arms could overcome both numerical superiority and the traditional notions of battlefield courage and spiritual resolve that had guided Japanese operations. The stage was set for a brutal, protracted struggle, where the American defensive advantage would continue to shape every engagement and force the Japanese to reconsider their assumptions about modern warfare.
The Guadalcanal Campaign was not only a test of firepower, fortifications, and tactical skill, but also a grueling confrontation with an environment that proved as lethal as any enemy. The dense jungle, swamps, rugged hills, and tropical climate created conditions that would sap strength, morale, and combat effectiveness, impacting both Japanese and American forces in profound ways. While the Americans had begun to turn the terrain to their defensive advantage, the jungle and disease themselves emerged as deadly weapons, silent adversaries that could disrupt supply lines, erode combat readiness, and inflict casualties without a single shot fired. The realization of this harsh truth became a defining factor in the conduct and outcome of the campaign, forcing commanders to adapt in ways that went far beyond conventional tactics. From the moment soldiers landed on Guadalcanal, they were confronted with the challenges of the island's dense and often impenetrable vegetation. Thick vines, towering trees, and undergrowth limited visibility to just a few meters, turning even a short advance into a treacherous endeavor. Movement through the jungle was slow and exhausting, particularly for Japanese troops, who often carried heavy loads of ammunition, rations, and equipment over steep ridges and muddy slopes. Paths were narrow and easily obstructed by fallen trees or mudslides, and the risk of ambush or miscalculation was ever present. American forces, while better supplied, were not immune to these challenges. The need to clear fields of fire and establish defensive positions required significant labor and constant maintenance. The jungle's density also made it difficult to coordinate movements and maintain communication, meaning that units could easily become isolated or delayed, a vulnerability that both sides had to contend with. Disease compounded the threat of the jungle environment, emerging as a highly effective weapon. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses were rampant, thriving in the wet, warm, and mosquito-infested conditions of the Solomon Islands. Japanese troops, often poorly supplied and lacking effective prophylactics, suffered devastating rates of infection. Malaria, in particular, incapacitated large portions of units, reducing the fighting strength of regiments even before they engaged the enemy. Dysentery and gastrointestinal illnesses further weakened soldiers, making it difficult to march, carry equipment, or sustain prolonged combat. For the Americans, the situation was somewhat mitigated by more robust medical logistics and the use of quinine and other preventative measures, yet disease still exacted a significant toll. Casualties from illness rivaled those from combat, forcing commanders to account for attrition in ways that went beyond bullets and shells. The physical environment also magnified the psychological strain on soldiers. Constant exposure to heat, humidity, insects, and the threat of disease created chronic fatigue, irritability, and stress. Nights offered little respite. The sounds of the jungle, calls of nocturnal animals, rustling foliage, and the ever-present threat of enemy movement kept soldiers in a near-perpetual state of vigilance. For Japanese troops, who were often isolated from reliable supplies and faced with the unpredictability of Allied air and naval dominance, the psychological burden was compounded by hunger and inadequate shelter. Malnutrition weakened the body's ability to fight disease and recover from exertion, and the lack of sleep and comfort eroded morale over time. In this sense, the jungle and disease functioned almost as tactical weapons, shaping the effectiveness of forces even before they met in battle. Strategically, the Americans learned to exploit these environmental factors as part of their defensive advantage. By securing key positions and forcing Japanese troops to move along predictable routes through the jungle, the Marines could channel attackers into natural choke points where firepower could be concentrated. Swamps, rivers, and dense undergrowth became obstacles that slowed the enemy, giving defenders more time to respond and inflict casualties. Observation posts on ridges allowed for early warning of movements through the jungle, and small patrols could harass supply lines and ambush isolated groups, further amplifying the impact of terrain. Even when direct combat did not occur, the attritional effects of forced marches through disease-prone areas and poorly navigable terrain sapped the strength of the Japanese forces, illustrating that nature itself could be weaponized in conjunction with traditional military tactics. Supply and logistics were deeply affected by the environment as well. The Japanese reliance on Tokyo Express night runs to deliver troops and supplies was fraught with danger, as ships had to navigate treacherous waters while evading American naval and air patrols. Once supplies reached the island, troops still faced the grueling task of transporting them through jungle paths and over ridges to reach front lines. American forces, benefiting from more secure supply lines, anchored by Henderson Field and naval control, faced similar challenges, but were better equipped to overcome them with engineering efforts, road construction, and logistical planning. Nevertheless, even minor disruptions due to mud, fallen trees, or disease-related manpower shortages could have disproportionate effects on operational tempo. The environment thus amplified the vulnerability of overstretched supply lines and emphasized the importance of preparation, adaptability, and local knowledge. Combat in the jungle environment also required tactical innovation. Traditional formations and maneuvers were often impractical, and both sides had to adapt to close-quarter fighting where visibility and mobility were severely restricted. Japanese forces, accustomed to regressive assaults and bayonet charges, sometimes found their tactics blunted by the Marines' prepared defensive positions and the difficulty of maneuvering through dense vegetation. The Americans responded by emphasizing fire discipline, overlapping fields of fire, and the use of grenades, mortars, and small unit coordination to engage enemy forces effectively. Patrols, ambushes, and sniper fire became critical tools, allowing smaller units to delay, disrupt, or attrit larger forces before they could consolidate for an attack. In this way, the jungle environment favored defenders who could leverage preparation, observation, and technology, while penalizing attackers reliant on rapid, coordinated assaults over open terrain. Medical infrastructure on Guadalcanal played a vital role in mitigating the impact of disease, particularly for the Americans. Field hospitals and medical teams were established to treat malaria, dysentery, and injuries sustained in combat. Prophylactic measures, including quinine distribution, mosquito netting, and sanitation protocols, reduced the incidence of disease, allowing a higher proportion of soldiers to remain combat-ready. Japanese forces, in contrast, lacked comparable medical support and often had to continue operations despite widespread illness. The cumulative effect of disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition created a slow attrition that weakened Japanese operational capability even before engagement with American forces.
In effect, the jungle became both a physical and medical battleground, where survival depended as much on hygiene, nutrition, and rest as on skill with a rifle or bayonet. The combined influence of jungle and disease reshaped operational planning for both sides. Commanders had to account not only for enemy strength and terrain, but also for attrition caused by environmental factors. Offensive operations required careful timing, coordination, and realistic assessment of troop readiness, while defensive operations sought to maximize the impact of terrain and natural obstacles. Over time, it became clear that the environment was not merely a backdrop for combat, but an active participant in the struggle, capable of imposing limits, dictating tactics, and influencing strategic outcomes. Both Japanese and American forces had to develop an acute awareness of how to navigate, survive, and exploit the jungle and its associated hazards, turning what could have been a crippling liability into a component of operational planning. In conclusion, the Guadalcanal Campaign demonstrated that the environment itself could serve as a deadly weapon, shaping the effectiveness of both attackers and defenders in profound ways. The dense jungle, difficult terrain, and prevalence of disease created a battlefield where traditional notions of numerical superiority and aggressive assault were insufficient to guarantee success. American forces, by adapting to these conditions, implementing preventative measures, and integrating environmental factors into their defensive planning, were able to gain an advantage over Japanese troops who struggled with supply, health, and mobility. The interplay of jungle, disease, and tactical innovation underscored the multidimensional nature of warfare in the Pacific, highlighting that victory depended not only on firepower and courage, but also on the ability to understand, endure, and exploit the lethal environment in which the battle was fought. As Guadalcanal became a prolonged struggle of attrition and adaptation, the deadly weapons of nature proved just as influential as any conventional armament, leaving a lasting lesson in the importance of environmental mastery in modern warfare.
The early stages of the Guadalcanal Campaign forced a profound and sobering reassessment within the Japanese military. For decades, Japan had prided itself on the superiority of its soldiers, its aggressive tactics, and its seemingly unstoppable advances across Asia and the Pacific. From Manchuria to the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had achieved rapid victories, fostering a belief in the invincibility of Japanese martial skill and the inevitability of success. Guadalcanal, however, shattered these illusions, confronting the Japanese high command with a combination of logistical failures, environmental hardships, and a tenacious American resistance that was far beyond what they had anticipated. The campaign became a turning point, not only in the Solomon Islands, but in the Japanese military mindset itself, marking the first significant recognition that their previous assumptions about warfare and their own invulnerability required serious reconsideration. Prior to the landing on Guadalcanal, Japanese planners had expected to meet relatively light resistance from American forces. Intelligence assessments suggested that the Allies' presence was minimal and disorganized, and that a few well-coordinated landings by Japanese troops could secure the island swiftly. This overconfidence was rooted in previous victories across the Pacific, where Japan had often faced poorly prepared or numerically inferior opponents. The belief in qualitative superiority, well-trained soldiers, fanatical devotion, and innovative tactics was a cornerstone of Japanese doctrine, leading commanders to assume that determination and aggression would outweigh any material or numerical disadvantage. However, the reality on Guadalcanal was starkly different. The Americans had fortified positions, maintained air superiority through Henderson Field, and demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for rapid adaptation.
Japanese forces were confronted not with disorganized militia, but with disciplined, well-supplied Marines who could defend, reinforce, and counterattack with coordination that challenged every preconception. The initial landings and ensuing battles highlighted the stark consequences of logistical underestimation. Japanese supply lines were tenuous, relying on high-speed destroyer runs and sporadic convoys under the constant threat of Allied air and naval interdiction. The difficulty of sustaining troops in the jungle environment, combined with insufficient medical and engineering support, caused a gradual but relentless attrition of manpower and morale. Japanese soldiers were forced to fight not only against a determined enemy, but against hunger, disease, and exhaustion, undermining their ability to execute the decisive, rapid strikes that doctrine traditionally emphasized. Commanders in Tokyo and the field began to recognize that their operational assumptions had failed to account for the complexity of sustaining offensive campaigns against a prepared and adaptable opponent in hostile terrain. The perception that Japanese martial skill alone could guarantee victory was being systematically dismantled. The repeated Japanese counterattacks against entrenched American positions on Guadalcanal further underscored the need for a reassessment. Early assaults often relied on massed infantry charges, night attacks, and attempts to exploit perceived weaknesses in American lines. While these tactics had proven effective in previous campaigns, on Guadalcanal they were met with devastating firepower, coordinated defensive strategies, and the strategic use of terrain by the Marines. Each failed assault exacted a heavy toll, reducing troop strength and exposing weaknesses in planning and intelligence. Japanese commanders, long accustomed to the benefits of surprise and offensive initiative, were forced to confront a reality in which conventional aggressiveness could no longer ensure success. The mismatch between expectation and reality created not only operational strain, but a psychological shift, prompting a deeper evaluation of doctrine, tactical flexibility, and the role of logistical support in modern warfare. A critical aspect of this shift was the growing awareness of American industrial and logistical capacity. Japanese military culture often emphasized personal courage, initiative, and the quality of the soldier, sometimes at the expense of acknowledging the impact of sustained material support. Guadalcanal revealed that the Americans could rapidly replace losses, reinforce positions, and maintain supplies under difficult conditions. The Marines' ability to hold Henderson Field and project air power across the island disrupted Japanese supply lines and made it increasingly apparent that raw bravery and aggressive tactics could not overcome systematic logistical and operational advantages. Japanese leaders began to confront the uncomfortable truth that modern warfare required a balance of skill, strategy, and industrial capability. A realization that challenged long-standing beliefs about the primacy of the individual soldier's prowess. The environmental realities of Guadalcanal also forced a reevaluation of strategy. The jungle, disease, and harsh terrain that had debilitated Japanese troops were not incidental obstacles, but integral factors that shaped operational success. Japanese forces had underestimated the difficulty of maneuvering through dense forests and mountainous ridges, as well as the impact of tropical illnesses that incapacitated significant numbers of soldiers. Repeated failures in the field demonstrated that successful operations required meticulous planning, engineering support, medical infrastructure, and sustained supply chains. The Japanese military began to recognize that their previous emphasis on rapid, decisive offensives without adequate logistical preparation was a critical vulnerability.
Guadalcanal thus became a laboratory of hard-earned lessons in the limitations of traditional doctrine when confronted with the complex realities of protracted island warfare. Leadership dynamics within the Japanese military also shifted as a result of these lessons. Field commanders were increasingly forced to communicate the severity of the situation to Tokyo, advocating for adjustments in strategy, reinforcements, and changes in operational planning. This dialogue, often characterized by tension between high command expectations and the on-the-ground reality, highlighted a growing disconnect between doctrinal confidence and empirical evidence. The campaign exposed a reluctance within certain segments of Japanese leadership to adapt swiftly, as entrenched beliefs in the superiority of tactics and the inevitability of success clashed with the necessity of pragmatic reassessment. Over time, however, the cumulative weight of failed assaults, environmental attrition, and logistical strain compelled a grudging acknowledgement that traditional assumptions could no longer dictate strategy unchallenged. Guadalcanal also catalyzed a broader intellectual shift in Japanese military thinking regarding combined arms and inter-service coordination. The campaign demonstrated that air power, naval support, artillery, and infantry operations were inextricably linked in determining the outcome of engagements. Isolated reliance on infantry skill or audacious assault was insufficient in the face of integrated American defenses, which leveraged air superiority, artillery fire, and naval presence to reinforce tactical positions and disrupt Japanese initiatives. Recognition of this reality led to an increased, though often belated emphasis on coordination among different branches of the military. The Japanese military began to confront the complexity of modern warfare in a way that went beyond individual heroism, stressing the importance of logistics, intelligence, inter-service communication, and the adaptation of doctrine to specific operational environments. Psychologically, the shift in perception was profound. For decades, Japanese soldiers had internalized notions of honor, sacrifice, and the inevitability of victory, reinforced by a string of successful campaigns. Guadalcanal imposed a stark confrontation with failure, attrition, and the limits of human endurance in the face of well-prepared opposition. The recognition that Japanese forces could be systematically thwarted by an opponent with fewer preconceptions about terrain, supply, and modern firepower eroded the myth of invincibility. Morale among both troops and commanders was tested, and while Japanese culture emphasized courage and determination, the cumulative effect of these setbacks fostered a more cautious, measured approach in subsequent operations. Guadalcanal, in essence, forced the Japanese military to confront the sobering truth that the battlefield was as much a contest of adaptation and resource management as it was.
The Guadalcanal Campaign's conclusion marked a turning point in the Pacific theater, both strategically and historically, solidifying a shift in momentum from the Japanese to the Allies. Strategically, the campaign represented the first major offensive victory for the United States against Japanese forces, demonstrating that Japan's expansionist advance could be halted and reversed. Prior to Guadalcanal, Japanese forces had enjoyed a seemingly unbroken string of victories across the Pacific, from Southeast Asia to the Solomon Islands, instilling a sense of invincibility in both military circles and the civilian population. The success of American forces in holding Henderson Field and ultimately forcing Japanese withdrawal shattered this perception, signaling that the Allies were capable not only of resisting Japanese expansion, but also of projecting power effectively into contested regions. This shift in momentum had profound implications for subsequent operations across the Pacific, influencing strategic planning, resource allocation, and military doctrine on both sides of the conflict. The campaign also underscored the critical importance of logistics, supply chains, and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Guadalcanal revealed that numerical superiority and aggressive tactics alone were insufficient for success. Sustained operations required secure supply lines, reliable transportation, and the ability to maintain troops in hostile environments. For the Japanese, the difficulties of resupplying forces across extended sea routes exposed vulnerabilities that would recur in later battles, such as in New Guinea and the Central Pacific. Conversely, the United States demonstrated that a combination of industrial output, logistical coordination, and flexible operational planning could compensate for initial disadvantages in terrain familiarity and troop experience. Henderson Field became more than a runway for aircraft. It was a symbol of American capability to sustain and project force in remote and contested locations. Control of the airfield allowed the Allies to interdict Japanese supply efforts, conduct reconnaissance, and support ground operations, fundamentally shaping the strategic balance in the Solomon Islands and the broader Pacific. The historical significance of Guadalcanal also lies in its demonstration of the integration of combined arms and joint operations. For the first time in the Pacific theater, American forces effectively coordinated land, sea, and air assets to achieve a coherent strategic objective. Naval engagements, such as the Battle of Savo Island and the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, illustrated the critical interplay between surface fleets and air support, while ground operations highlighted the importance of engineering, intelligence, and close air support in overcoming entrenched defenders. This comprehensive approach foreshadowed subsequent American campaigns in the Central Pacific, including the island-hopping strategy that would bypass heavily fortified positions in favor of strategically vital targets. Guadalcanal provided a practical model for integrated operations, underscoring that success required synchronization across multiple domains rather than reliance on isolated force elements. The campaign's impact on Japanese strategy was equally profound. The repeated failures to dislodge American forces forced a reevaluation of offensive doctrine, emphasizing the limits of frontal assaults and the necessity of coordinated, well-supported operations. Japanese commanders became increasingly aware that aggressive tactics without adequate preparation and supply could lead to catastrophic losses. Guadalcanal also revealed the strategic implications of attrition. Even when individual units demonstrated bravery and skill, sustained losses over weeks of combat gradually eroded operational capacity. This understanding influenced subsequent Japanese decisions, including the cautious defense of fortified positions in the Central and Western Pacific, and a more conservative approach to committing forces in battles where the logistical and industrial balance favored the Allies. The psychological effect of the Guadalcanal defeats undermined the aura of invincibility that had long accompanied Japanese military culture, reshaping planning, morale, and public perception. From a historical perspective, Guadalcanal holds significance for its role in shaping the broader narrative of the Pacific War. The campaign became a symbol of American resilience, adaptability, and emerging dominance, highlighting the ability of a democratic, industrially advanced nation to mobilize resources, innovate tactically, and persevere under adverse conditions. The experiences gained by Marines, soldiers, sailors, and aviators during the campaign informed training, doctrine, and leadership across subsequent operations. Lessons in jungle warfare, amphibious assault, combined arms coordination,
and the handling of disease and environmental challenges provided a foundation for success in later campaigns, including Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Guadalcanal thus served as both a crucible for developing American operational proficiency and a template for executing complex, multi-domain campaigns in the Pacific. The campaign's influence extended beyond purely military considerations to affect political and diplomatic dimensions of the war. The ability to secure and hold Guadalcanal reinforced confidence among Allied leaders in the Pacific strategy, bolstering morale and validating commitments of resources and personnel. At the same time, Japanese failures on the island contributed to internal tensions and debates over strategy, priorities, and resource allocation, exposing vulnerabilities in leadership and planning. The psychological dimension of victory and defeat on Guadalcanal resonated with both populations. Americans gained a tangible sense that Japan could be challenged and defeated, while the Japanese public and military leadership were forced to confront the reality that their previously unchecked advance was now under serious threat. This interplay of military success and psychological impact highlights Guadalcanal's broader significance as a transformative event that influenced perceptions, policy, and the course of subsequent operations. The operational lessons of Guadalcanal also informed broader Allied strategy regarding amphibious warfare and island-hopping campaigns. By demonstrating the effectiveness of seizing strategically vital positions, establishing airfields, and denying resources and lines of communication to the enemy, the campaign provided a practical template for bypassing heavily fortified positions in favor of operationally advantageous objectives. This approach would define the next phase of the Pacific War, where selective engagement, control of key logistical nodes, and coordinated multi-domain operations became central to Allied strategy. Guadalcanal, therefore, was not only a battle for a single island, but a testing ground for broader strategic concepts that would be applied across the Central and South Pacific, shaping the trajectory of the war toward eventual Allied victory. In addition, Guadalcanal's legacy influenced the evolution of military doctrine regarding the interplay between environment, disease, and combat effectiveness. The campaign underscored the reality that tropical diseases, malnutrition, and harsh terrain could be as lethal as enemy fire, reshaping planning for troop deployment, medical support, and logistical preparation. The United States and its allies learned to prioritize preventative medicine, field sanitation, and adaptive supply chains, while Japanese forces struggled to mitigate these challenges. These lessons would resonate in subsequent Pacific operations, contributing to an understanding that mastery of the environment was inseparable from operational success. Guadalcanal thus reinforced a holistic approach to warfare, integrating human, material, and environmental considerations into strategic and tactical planning. Furthermore, Guadalcanal's strategic significance extended to its impact on the broader Allied campaign in the Pacific. Securing the Solomon Islands created a critical stepping stone for advances towards the Philippines, New Guinea, and ultimately Japan itself. The island became a hub for projecting air and naval power, enabling the Allies to disrupt Japanese communications, interdict supply lines, and establish staging areas for future operations. Control of Guadalcanal shifted the initiative to the Allies, forcing Japanese forces into a defensive posture that would persist throughout the remainder of the war. This strategic advantage not only accelerated the timeline of Allied operations, but also demonstrated the cumulative effect